So thank you for joining our walkthrough on running ACE unit tests from inside a container. So what we're looking to do in this walkthrough is build a container containing the tools and components required to run ACE unit tests. The idea being that once we have a container that we can run ACE unit tests for, we can run those tests from a CI/CD environment. So we're going to take an existing ACE container Docker file. We're going to add some things to it to make our testing for ACE unit tests easy. We're going to then tag and push that container into Docker Hub, and then we're going to create a GitHub action using that container to run some unit tests. We're going to use an Ant script for that. From there, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the process of running that unit test and getting some results and viewing those results in Sonarqube, so we can see our test coverage and our issues and violations that are reported. So we're building our Docker file based on the ACE Docker file provided by IBM, which I've added to our repository here. Now you don't necessarily need to add it to your own repository, but it's just handy to have it around to see exactly what's happening. And I've made it a bit more simple, so basically rather than using parameters and arguments, I've just hard-coded the link to the appropriate file to download. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this file and we're going to add the components we need to run our unit tests. So this here is our updated file, or this is our Docker file. So it's going to be based on that ACE file, and what we're going to do is add some additional components to it. The main components we're going to add are the Sonarqube client, or the Sonarqube scanner, and Ant. Now, because we were installing Ant, there will be a few dependencies for those two components, so we'll also need to install those. So to start off, we're going to install tar and unzip, because we're going to be able to download and unzip and untar the necessary components. And there's some extra components we needed to add in that were specific to running our plugin. So what we're going to do here, we're going to download, because we're installing Ant. We need to run the install for a Java. So we picked the Java JDK or OpenJDK. So we're going to download that from an external site. Now this isn't productionized as far as appropriate for your particular environment, so if you're actually doing this yourselves, what you might do is use your own registry or your own proxying registry, so that you wouldn't be dependent on external downloads that may not be available when you actually want to run this build. That also improves the security, because once you've got it into your own registry or your proxy, it reduces the chances of supply-side attacks, because you can download it, scan it, and make it available to your build process. So we've got our download. We're going to unpack it into this JDK directory using tar. We're also going to set up the Java home and the path to make use of that JDK. Next, we're going to download Ant, and the same suggestions apply as before. Ideally, you wouldn't be directly downloading; you'd be going through your own proxy. Going to download Ant, unpack Ant using tar, and set up appropriate environment variables. Now the Ant script we're going to be using won't actually require any of those parameters. It will be environment variables. We'll be using absolute paths for the setup, just because it's a bit more safe. And the last one is downloading the Sonar scanner install, unzipping that into a directory, and then setting up a path for it. And my last step here, you can see for Ant, is make Ant executable. Now, the test project that we have is based on is very similar to the same project we used in our other videos and other demonstrations and walkthroughs. Now, that actually includes the usage of MQ. So we have flows in our test project that when you read from MQ, or read from an MQ queue and do some work and then produce some outputs. Now, when we deploy our ACE server, we actually need to have our MQ client available to package up and install our bar file. So even though we aren't using our bar file in our unit tests, aren't using our queues in our unit tests, in fact we explicitly disable them, it still requires a client to be installed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go and grab an MQ client from IBM. We're going to untar it or unpack it using tar. We're then going to run the install using the accept flag, which puts it into this MQ server environment. We're then going to go and run the RPM install for a whole bunch of those packages which have been unzipped and unpacked there. Which gives us our MQ client, and then we're going to make it usable from our ACE user, which is the user that our base IBM image was wanting to set up. So once we've gone through that base image, we kind of want to go back to the original state as far as the user that was being used. So we're going to switch back to our ACE user, just so that we're consistent with what IBM set up. The rest of these installs here are relating to a demo project which is packaged along with it, just to show you that it's kind of working, so you can actually run a demo project without having to do any setup for the container, and we'll give you some results. Now we're not using it in the same way this time, but it's just been left in place. And the only other thing is to copy in all the some of the necessary libraries into the container, because those are the ones that the Ant script is going to depend on, including our BCT plugin or our MB Precise plugin. So that's setting up the Docker file for the to run our unit tests. What we need to do now is we're going to set up a workflow or a GitHub action to make use of this. So here's our GitHub project. That we're running this with. We're going to jump into the workflows, and I've called it the trace workflow because it's using the trace process to capture test coverage. Now I've disabled the build process for branches and pulls, or pushes to branches, I should say, just because I want to be able to run this manually. So I'm just running this manually for a couple of reasons. One, it's just easier for me doing demonstrations to run things when I want to run them, and also just doesn't use up my GitHub free capacity. So ideally, I just want to run the jobs I want. Now, this wouldn't be what you would be running in your own CI/CD environment. You'd more or less have these jobs running constantly and running depending on various branches and flags and various other policies. But in this case, for the simple point process, we're just going to run it manually. So we'll just go through this GitHub workflow, give it a name. We're going to base it on this kind of default Ubuntu latest for workflows. We're going to check out the code. We're going to grab another action, and this action allows us to pass in the name of a Docker image to run, and this action is for running other Docker images. So what we're going to do is going to run our script is going to run our Docker image. It's going to request our Docker image. It's going to set some flags to run our Docker image. It's going to mount our source code that we've checked out into our Docker image and set the working folder. We've got a little bit of debugging here. We're going to set up the MQ profile, and then we're going to run our Ant script. At the end of it, we're going to take the coverage file produced, and we're going to ship it off to Sonar along with the source code for Sonarqube to do its analysis. So what's in our trace build file? Let me jump back to our trace build file. Sorry, our trace ant file for our build. This is our trace ant file. So what we're doing is we're setting up the necessary jars, which you copied in when we build our container. Setting up an ant task for consuming the trace, which is the thing that takes the ACE trace file and converts it into our generic coverage file format, which Sonarqube is going to consume. We're going to, because we're using ACE tests, and ACE tests rely on Java, which we've covered in previous versions, previous workflows, walkthroughs, the package doesn't actually do the Java compile for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to compile up all our Java tests, which are these files here. Which are these test classes here. You can see here there's a test. It does reads in a sample, reads in a assembly from a path. This file that contains a bunch of information about what was going into the component when the test is being called. We're going to then run the assembly, or run the node within the message flow using that input. Grab the output, do some assertions around the output to validate that the test did something that we wanted to do. We're also, in the next part of the script, going to package up the resources, which are these test files that go in and expected results that go out. And you can see here from the input, it's an XML based on what the state of the data that went into the node was. So yeah, we're going to package up, compile and jar up those test classes. We're going to package up those resources, those test files that I mentioned a second ago. And then what we're going to do is build our bar file using our source code, our packaged up jar, and some other bits and pieces relating to the project. The next step is to create our integration server. So we're going to go in and we're going to create our integration server, or create an empty integration server. Now, the task to do that, it's kind of is a bit of a confusing name. It's create work, or MQSI create work directory, which actually is creating a default empty integration server that we can put things into and start. So in this case here, we're replacing the server configuration file with our own configuration file, or the default configuration file with our own configuration file, and that configuration file has some extra settings for us, and these settings are the ones that enable the tracing. So what we've got here is we've enabled, let's have a look here. We've enabled user trace, so it's disabled normally. So we've enabled the debug user trace and given it a file size that we think is appropriate, and that's going to get copied into our integration server. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take out, now there's a couple of options for running things. We could start an integration server, deploy something to it, and then run our tests. Not as ideal for test cases, because sometimes it takes longer to start the integration server and copy and deploy the bar file in than it does for the test to run. So we're going to do, and also in a more infrastructure as code approach, we're going to pre-package our integration server with our bar file. So we're going to copy our bar file into our integration server, and then we're going to copy our bar file into our integration server, and then we're going to copy in the policy files that allow us access to start things that relate to MQ. That means that our server is pre-configured, and at this point, if we were doing like a real ACE server, or sorry, we're going to say real ACE server, something that's more destined to run in production, this is the same approach we'd use where we have packaged everything into our Docker image. Or we'd package this into our Docker image, and then our Docker image would be snapshotted at that point with all the compile components in our server with all the appropriate configuration settings there ready for when the image starts, or the container starts. In this case here, we're running it from Ant. The next part is actually run the tests. So here we're going to start that integration server, the one we were referring to when we created that work directory server. Turn on some logging. Tell it which project we're actually running, tell it not to start message flows, so don't try to connect to a queue manager, don't try to pull queues and trigger message flows, and then stop as a bit of a safeguard, stop after 60 seconds if the tests sort of run infinitum, or run infinitely. So this runs our server, runs our tests, and we kick out a message at the end just to say we're finished. And then what we're going to do is then take, call that consume trace ant task we mentioned before that we'd set up above. We're going to run that to take our trace file, using just pointing to our trace file here, which has been generated into our integration server when our test case is run this consume trace task and produce a coverage file. That coverage file is then what we're going to use to ship to Sonar. So if we go back to our workflow, the next step is take that coverage file that we just produced at the end of our Ant script and ship it to Sonar when we do the analysis. Now, how does it look like when it runs? What we do is we go into actions. We would either, because our CL/CD platform had triggered our build because of our arguments for when a build should run, or in this case I could run it manually, but I'm just going to look at one previously. I just ran a few minutes ago just to make the presentation a bit quicker. So what I can do is jump into my workflow results, and the one I'm interested in here is the build process with Docker. So what we can see here is it's pulling a whole bunch of Docker layers in, validating those Docker files, Docker layers, running checksums and whatnot. And this is all just our Docker in Docker, or our GitHub action running Docker setup. So that's set up installed our Docker locally. So we can see here we've downloaded the image. This is the debugging I mentioned. We'll just check some files, make sure we're in the right place before we run things. We can see here I've started the Ant task. I'm creating the bar file and zipping up things appropriately. I'm then packaging up. I'm creating the zip files for the bar file, and then packaging up the zip files and the code into a bar file, copying in that configuration file that I mentioned. We're then starting to run the test, copying in the bar file, copying in the policy. We're then running our test, and this is where we're sort of interested in the ACE output. So this is the output from the ACE integration server as it's running. So what we can see here, there's some debug to say these are the tests I'm running, and what we're looking to see is that we've got one test here run successfully, and we can see here that we've got one test passed, no fails, and 0 tests aborted. And we can see our logging message, so we finished successfully. After that, what we're going to do is take our run our consume trace task, which is going to take this trace file from an integration server, take the source code, produce a coverage file, and this is just debugging from creating the coverage file. So in this case here, we've run a coverage, we've run through the trace file, we've ignored a bunch of lines, grabbed a bunch of lines. So we've run through our source code, ignored a bunch of lines, looked at a bunch of lines as far as conditions go. We've gone through almost 1,500 lines of trace and looked at the 53. We've got 53 lines of trace information that we think is relevant to capturing coverage. Running our Sonar analysis. Finishing running our consume trace. Then we're going to run our Sonar analysis. And we can see here at the end of our Sonar analysis, we've got a message coming back that our analysis is finished, and we want to see results. We can see our results here. So these are the results in Sonarqube for our tests. We've got a bunch of issues here, so we've flagged a bunch of issues in our code based on the configuration we've got for Sonarqube, but then more interesting here, we've got our coverage. So we can see here we've got some code in here that hasn't been tested, but the one we're interested in is our simple testable, which is the one we wrote our test case for, which we have more details again I mentioned in our previous workthroughs about actually writing these ACE unit tests. So we can see here we've got our test coverage saying that this particular procedure was tested, and then we've got a branch, and of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branches, one of these branches was tested by this test case, or by the coverage from these test cases. and then we can see that the main was called and tested, and the copy message headers was called and tested, which you'd normally get with working with a flow. So that's us viewing the output from running a test in a container from a GitHub workflow pushed into our Sonarqube instance. Now, there's a couple of things I did jump over. One was building the image. So, as I mentioned, we've got these Docker files that we've got. The steps to build the Docker file are pretty well documented in various online documentation. So we pick our Docker file, we run our build into a tag, so our BCT tools tag. We tag it for the pushing to Docker Hub itself, and then we push our new image into Docker Hub, our version 10 of our image in this case, so that's available publicly from GitHub, so we don't need to authenticate to GitHub when we actually pull this image in. So obviously, if you're doing this in a more productionized version of running these tests, you would have your own image. You would have your own image in your own image registry, and it may have some other bits and pieces that are more proprietary for your testing environment, depending on what tools you're using. The other thing I did skip over was the Sonarqube bit. In this case here, we build to run Sonar, what we're doing is just on a box, just on a VM. We've got running Sonarqube. We pull a Sonarqube image that we're building, set up some data, and run it on port 9000, which is what we're seeing over here, running on port 9000. Now, to build the Sonar image itself, we've got a Sonarqube Docker file, and you can see here we use the default. So we use the Sonarqube provided Docker file, or Docker instance, or Dockerimage I should say, Sonarqube 5.4. We then basically extend that by adding in our plugin, and then adding in the necessary jar file, which allows us to do the test coverage reporting, which doesn't come out of the box with Sonarqube 5.4. We build that as an image, and then we run that, and that's what gives us those nice results. So thank you for joining for our walkthrough. If you do have any questions, or would you like to reach out, you can find us our details on our website. That's or email. So you can email me at richard@bettercodingtools.com, or contact us via our contact page on our website, www.bettercodingtools.com. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.